WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and our conversation to the death of Jordan McNair, because quite frankly, it became a he said, she said, and certainly the journalism side of this is still peeling back the onion as to everything that's going on there with DJ Durkin. Obviously, the Terps keep taking to the field, winning some football games. But when kids die on campuses, real journalists show up, and I am thankful for that, and certainly thankful for my relationship with the folks at HBO to grab me John Frankel, who has been here working and talking about the death of Jordan McNair with family members, and I think we're just at the beginning of this, John. I know you're not out on Twitter, and I usually say follow along, but I know you can follow along at HBO, and I do, that you guys are going to have a segment here coming up this week that folks can set the DVR, watch it on demand wherever, and I know you've spent some time here. I don't even know the background on what you're working on, so always good to have you on, though.
Thanks so much. I mean, I can give you the background in that we had started looking at this story on a much broader note. Jordan McNair, unfortunately, falls into a pattern that we had been looking at and started filming actually nearly a year ago, last November, when we noticed that there had been a high number of deaths in college football that had nothing to do with the high-speed collisions and the risks of orthopedic injuries and brain injuries that have dominated the headlines of football at all levels for the last 8, 9, 10 years. And what we were startled to see was that there were, prior to Jordan, 29 players since 2000. So in 18 years, or 17 years, 29 guys at college football had died in their off-season conditioning and training. So not getting hit, but merely getting themselves ready to play this game. And we were somewhat startled. And as we began to look into it, what we discovered was that there was very little oversight by the NCAA, even though there had been some recommendations from notable people in the profession who said there are some very basic, simple steps you can take here for better practices to institute so that strength and conditioning coaches and training staffs at these universities can implement in order to protect these kids. So what were the deaths that we were talking about? We're talking about what Dr. Casa at the University of Connecticut, who runs the Corey Stringer Center, says are sudden deaths, meaning guys who are dying from heat stroke, heat exhaustion, over excessive exertion in exercise that gets them into trouble, and often results in something called rhabdomyolysis, which is a breakdown of proteins into the blood system and can send guys to the hospital, and has on many occasions. But more notably, the heat stroke and the heat exhaustion. And we all know that, from Casa's setting up his office at the University of Connecticut, that resulted from Corey Stringer in the NFL, who died back in 2000 with the Minnesota Vikings, an offensive lineman. Important to note here that no NFL player since Corey Stringer has died as a result of these sorts of issues. And yet now with Jordan McNair, we're talking about 30 college football players who have died from heat exhaustion, from heat stroke and such in that time, in the last 18 years.
John Frankel is our guest. He, of course, is at HBO and Real Sports, and you can follow him out there on a story this week. So the Corey Stringer thing, a little background on me. I was actually working for your employer, HBO, that day in New York City. It was the launch of HBO's Hard Knocks series, and Ross Greenberg put me to work in Bryant Park promoting the launch. We had the T-shirts and all that stuff in New York City for the executives and whatnot. And that was the day Corey Stringer died on a field out in Minnesota, or it might have been Wisconsin at that time. I'm not sure exactly where that was.
They were in there, and I stand corrected. It was 2001, so forgive me. Yes, and it was Mankato, Minnesota.
Okay, so and Brian Billick is my dear friend. He's my partner here on behalf of the Living Classrooms Foundation. 17 years later, Brian obviously knew Corey Stringer pretty well, and it hit home with Brian. It hit home with me. I was in New York. It was an NFL player. I'm at an NFL media training camp, promotional function when this is going on. And I had no idea 17 years later, I had no idea 5 minutes ago, there's such a thing called a Corey Stringer Insta. I didn't know. I know his name. I remember the legend of that, and I know nothing else like that has happened in the NFL. But the NFL is about, 53 players in 32 cities. we play football all over this country, right? Pee Wee, Pop Warner, high school, club, semi-pro, indoor football. There's football being played everywhere. When people die in other places, I guess 29 of these things happen. And unless it happened in your hometown or your local newspaper, if it still exists, or your local TV station, it hasn't really flooded its way into the mainstream, has it, John?
It hasn't. And I think that, one of the things that sort of drew our attention to it and then made us want to follow up and spend the last year or so looking at this is that if I said to you, more than likely, if I said to you that college tennis had lost even half that number, 15 guys or women had died playing tennis because they played under severe conditions.
Or something like wrestling where, like, you could break a neck, right? Like, literally,
Sure.
It's not badminton, right? Exactly.
No, exactly. And people would turn and take notice, and not only would they take notice, but they'd say, we've got a problem here, and we need to address the problem. And one of the people that we talked to in this piece, who has written several papers on this and has been very vocal with the NCAA and has worked with Dr. Casa, is the head trainer, longtime head trainer at the University of Oklahoma, Scott Anderson. And the sad thing that he says is that this is all predictable, that it's going to happen. And not only is it predictable, as Dr. Casa would say, and Scott Anderson would say, all preventable. So you're dealing with these two Ps, predictable and preventable, and yet here we are in 2018 saying that over the last 18 years, 30 young men have died not playing football, but merely preparing to play football. And so here's the issue, and we look at a couple of different examples, and they're not all that different from the situation that Jordan McNair went through at the University of Maryland. First of all, it all starts with a promise. You know the recruiting verbiage.
I'm going to take good care of your boy.
I'm going to take care of your boy like he's my own, okay? And most parents, as the McNair family told us, most parents ask some basic questions because more than likely they haven't been through the recruiting process before. But what they don't take care to ask is, because they assume that it's a given, is what sorts of things do you have in place to take care of my son or my daughter, if you're talking about a female athlete at the collegiate level, which is, what sort of safeguards and help do you have if my child has some mental health issues? What are you going to do in the case of heat exhaustion? What sort of centers and help and resources do you have available for these things? So most parents don't know to ask this. The other thing they don't know to ask is, who's going to be spending the most amount of time with my son? The head coach walks into your living room. Maybe the position coach walks in, or more often than not, it might also be just the assistant coach who handles that recruiting area. But in many cases, as we've been told by many of these athletes, when it comes to football, they're spending most of their time with the strength and conditioning coach. And that's because, think about the season. The season starts with camp in August and ends in November. Maybe there's a bowl game in December. But that's it. And then, because of the NCAA's regulations and rules, the head coach and oftentimes the position coaches can't have contact with these kids but for that month of spring ball. But that doesn't mean they're off the hook and they're not training and conditioning and lifting weights all off season. So who's the person in charge? Well, it becomes the strength and conditioning coach. And so the parents they don't know enough to say, can I meet that person? Can I know what their qualifications are? How hard are they going to work my son? And these strength and conditioning coaches have essentially become partners with head coaches. And by that I mean, yes, they receive their check from the athletic department or the university, but they are being placed in a position where they are revered by their head coaches in a sense, because Coach at Iowa said, my strength and conditioning coach is the most important person on my staff.
Yeah, he gets them strong. He gets them ready to play. If the horses aren't for the courses, right? If they don't show up and play on Saturday, I don't have a job anymore, right?
That's right. And in fact, and they've almost become the de facto disciplinarian. So then the head coach is void of any responsibility, right? I'm not the one who meted out the hard workout. I'm not the one that punished the kid because he fumbled the ball in the fourth quarter at the goal line. That becomes the job of the strength and conditioning coach, sort of punitive workouts. And So, for instance, at Iowa, the strength and conditioning coach, Coach Doyle, is making $750,000. He's one of the highest paid state employees in Iowa.
Wow.
Okay? And he's had instances where he's overworked his players, and he sent 13 guys to the hospital a few years back because of this rhabdomyolysis that we discussed. But there are numerous incidents of this going on around the country. I'll give you another example. Coach Taggart is now at FSU. He has his guy, Erle Odorinde, who was his strength and conditioning coach at Oregon. When they first got to Oregon after they'd risen up the ranks of college football, on the very first day, Odorinde put guys through such a hard workout that 3 guys went to the hospital with rhabdomyolysis. But when Taggart moved from Oregon to FSU, who was the first guy he brought with him? Odorinde.
But it's a cultural thing about how hard you're going to work. How bad do you want it? Are you going to run an inch further, a mile, deeper, an hour long? I mean, all of that stuff. It's all portrayed in that way of these legendary workouts and workout warriors. And I mean, that's what the combine's all about, right? Who's the strongest? Who has the most endurance? That's where we are with the gladiator. That's what makes a football player, right?
No question. And these strength and conditioning coaches have, for lack of a better term maybe, become rock stars in their own right. And you see their videos online of them screaming and yelling and pushing. And oftentimes, as the case was at Maryland in the Jordan McNair situation, demeaning, insulting, and not recognizing, which is one of the issues we looked at, that a lot of these strength and conditioning coaches, they know how to tell a kid to lift a weight, but they're not certified, nor have they taken any classes in order to protect the health and safety of these young men. So there are classes that they can take, which literally are 13 hours or 21 hours in some cases, where they learn about weightlifting and the clean and jerk and so forth. But there is no instruction on health and safety. So that when they run a kid in 100-degree weather, and you could say, look, you need to, because sometimes you're going to play in that kind of weather, but there are plans that you can put in place and steps that you can take in order to prevent these things. And these guys are basically taking the attitude of, it's my job to get these 120 guys in shape. If one guy goes down, well, then it's the trainer's job to step in and know what to do. And what Scott Anderson at Oklahoma is saying, no, it's everybody's job. And if the strength and conditioning coach is the one person who's overseeing these practices, these training sessions, then they certainly need to have some responsibility and understanding of how to care for these athletes. And a couple of other examples that we look at in this story. A guy named Coach Boucher, who was at Kent State University a year ago, lost a young man there, a freshman football player. When we interviewed him, and now more than a year later, he still didn't understand how to respond to a kid who was suffering from heat stroke. He still didn't understand the basics of what Dr. Casa says is fundamental and will save a kid every single time, which is that if a kid is experiencing issues with heat stroke and he becomes unresponsive, or you see that he's not being able to follow directions clearly and he's struggling, that the first thing you would do is you would take the kid and put him into an ice tub that every team should have at conditioning and practices. And within minutes, your body temperature will drop. So if a kid is reaching 105, 106 degrees, immediately you get him in that ice tub. Before you call 911, before you call the ambulance, before you put him in the ambulance, you put him in an ice tub, and Dr. Casa swears that every one of those kids will be home eating pizza with his teammates in his dorm that night, if that's the step you take. And we're talking about an ice tub that you can go to Home Depot or any hardware store and buy for $240.
He is John Frankel. He is a real journalist. He's at HBO and Real Sports. They are airing a piece on Jordan McNair, one of 30 players who've died as a result of college football workouts in this century. It airs all week long. I can give you all the times at various places at HBO and HBO2 and on demand, which is how I do my Bill Maher and my HBO from time to time as well. So you came to Maryland. You find his parents. I mean, he's a Baltimore kid. It's been a big story here, John, but not a huge story. The dirty little secret about Maryland is not a whole lot of people in Baltimore or Washington care about Maryland. It's sort of in the middle of nowhere, and that's why no one goes to the games, and the Ravens and the Redskins play on Sunday, and I know you're aware of all of that. But there is this part of it that no one on campus wants to talk about it. They got soccer season, football team started the season 3-1, basketball's around the corner. It sort of gets swept into some place that they couldn't sweep Len Bias, and I'm old enough, and I was working in the Baltimore Sun newsroom on June 19th, 1986 as a 17-year-old kid on my internship, my first job, and, I remember that morning, and the fallout of that as a kid working in a newspaper with real journalists running around in 86, 87, 88, and what happened to Lefty Driesell, and what happened to Bob Wade, and the aftermath of the program, and no lights, no camera, and plenty of action. That was their marketing slogan. I don't feel like any of that's going on in Maryland. They're winning football games, and if they can go, to the big house next week and beat Michigan, life's good. And yet this broken family's left behind, and I don't know what's going to happen with Durkin. And obviously there's going to be $1 billion changing hands, and as Andrew Brandt says, there will be lawyers. But you came in and found parents, and I have a son. I have a son who played football in high school. I can't imagine, man.
It's very difficult to sit down with some parents and who were most gracious in opening up the doors to their home and sharing with us their feelings and talking to us about this. And, one of the things that the McNairs have done is that they've set up a foundation in Jordan's name, and they really want to try and make other parents aware of the situation that they're walking into and how they can be better educated, ask the right questions, and know what their son is up against when they move on to the college level, especially at that level. The McNairs were not unfamiliar with the idea of this was Jordan was recruited by some of the best colleges in the country. To address your Len Bias comparison, Len was obviously, top draft pick, the guy. Here, Jordan was a redshirt freshman who's one member of an offensive line at the University of Maryland, not the Ohio State University or Alabama. As you point out, where Maryland football ranks in people's eyes in that area is not the same, obviously, at the University of Alabama. And I don't know what would happen at the University of Alabama if this happened to a young man there. But I think that, Rick Court lost his job. He also received additional compensation to say goodbye. So there's no question there's going to be lawyers. There's no question there's going to be money. And when we spoke with the McNairs, we also spoke with their attorney, Hassan Murphy. And listen, to Maryland's credit, I guess, while you can say they broke a promise that Coach Durkin made to the McNairs, which is I would take care of your son like he's my own, to Maryland's credit, the university acknowledged that it was responsible. The first report has come out and said that people didn't do their jobs correctly. So that's a big step for a university to take that sort of public response. The University of California, Berkeley did the same when they lost a player, Ted Agu, back in 2014. And that was a young man who had sickle cell trait, and the strength and conditioning coach, Damon Harrington, just pushed and pushed and pushed. And when he was, when that case went to trial and he was put in front of a video deposition, he claimed that he didn't believe that there was any different way to treat an athlete with sickle cell trait, and which he was wrong on every front, medical doctors tell us. But Cal stepped up in that situation, and they took responsibility. Maryland's taken responsibility here. Obviously money, it might soften the wound a little bit, but it's certainly not going to make things a whole lot better for the McNairs who lost their son.
He is John Frankel. HBO Real Sports airs all week long, and of course, I always say the 60 minutes of the sports world. And certainly, when you show up, you show up in a lot of stressful environments, right? In these stories, and week after week, month after month, you guys are trying to get to the bottom of all of this. And it is a fascinating thing that all of this is. You've done gun control. All of these sort of things that pop up again and again and again, and yet, somewhere somebody's going to die of heat stroke, right, on a college campus or at a football practice somewhere. You think Corey Stringer's the end of it, and 2 decades later, you're sort of never at the end of of this. And then when the lawyers get involved, it's who pays for it and who can blame who. And I guess that's the ugly part of all of this. For the fans involved, for the Terps and people that love the Terps, is you want to go to the games, you want to support the university, the franchise, the brand, whatever it is that you're supporting. But, in the case of Maryland, there's a lot of pieces to be picked up here. And to your point, this is a fresh story. This is, not even a summer old at this point, and it's a recurring story. But we're just at the beginning of the Maryland Terps story on culpability and DJ Durkin and where all of this is going from a sports perspective. But then there's the personal side of this as well.
And I'll take it a step further. The really ugly part here, as you use that word, the really ugly part is the NCAA's lack of action here and the lack of oversight and the lack of motivation to implement better practices that have been recommended time and time again by people who are in the know, by experts who live it every day, whether it's Dr. Costa running the Corey Stringer Institute up at the University of Connecticut, or it's Scott Anderson, a well-respected, longtime trainer at the University of Oklahoma, one of the biggest programs around, who's saying, guys, this is easy. Here it is. Here's the checklist. Here's what you got to require from these schools. Here's the better certification practices for these strength and conditioning coaches, not just guys who came up as football players and, knew how to throw some weights around in a room and make guys run, 110-yard gassers. That here are the things that should be in place. They're not expensive. And frankly, even if they were, a little bit on the price, heavy on the price tag.
They have the dough. They just built $1 billion place down there.
We certainly know that Alabama and Ohio State and wherever, and it doesn't put the Kent States who lost a player or the smaller D1 schools at a disadvantage. There are simple steps that aren't expensive. And the fact that the NCAA isn't moved to do something, that's the ugly part. And as Brian says to me, and we talk about all the time, how many stories are we going to do about the NCAA that expose the warts of that organization and their lack of willingness to care about the athletes and to follow one of the mission statements of the NCAA, which is to take care of and to protect the health and safety of its athletes?
I'm surprised there's not more outrage from the other kids. You know what I mean? When a kid drops dead in front of them and their teammate, and they still put the jersey on, it is a little, and maybe it's part of being 18 or 19 and being a football player, but there is part of that if that happened in a workplace, like in a regular workplace where someone was dying in front of everyone and that person could have been saved and nobody did, it would be outrageous. But I guess in sports, to your point, 29 other times, this has become, and we sit here right now and we know in September of 2018, this will probably happen again in the next year, 2, 3, somewhere to somebody. But I know the education part of this is really part of what the only thing good can come from this, right? From doing stories about it and awareness is don't let this happen at your place.
Absolutely. And I think to make that point more, that one of the problems, obviously, you're asking kids who are 18, 19, 20 years old to be whistleblowers. And we all know the potential risks that lie in that, even for mature adults. And you're talking about young men who are counting on scholarships and to get through college and get themselves an education. And, for the one or two from each team that might have a chance to go to the pros, they're not likely to open up their mouths. They don't want to face the consequences if it's found out that they're the ones who gave an interview to HBO or they're the ones that went to talk and complained about it. And the fact that these guys also have no union. The NFL's got a players union. They watch out for their guys. The college football players don't have a union. There's no one speaking up for them until you have the McNair family. And does that voice reach far enough? And when you've got the NCAA, just to go back to that point again, when you've got the NCAA who declined to sit down for an interview with us, as they more often choose to, they just...
Anytime that happens in a public organization, it's always, what are you hiding? What are you hiding, right? And a lot of people hide from you, right? I mean, really.
Yeah, I mean, we're not on a lot of people's Christmas card list, but that's okay. There are enough responsible people who are willing to sit down and talk with us. That's not the case with the NCAA, but we did get a statement from them. But in their reference to this, what they say is we need to make improvements in this area, and we will take steps to explore how to change and address these data points. So they use data points as a way to refer and identify young athletes. How'd you like it if your son was referred to as a data point?
That is the NCAA. Keep investigating him, John. Keep him straight. We'll be watching out at HBO Real Sports. He is John Frankel. He's not on Twitter, and he's a better man because of it. John, take care of yourself. Thanks for making some time and for shedding some light on this. I haven't talked a whole lot about it because, quite frankly, I don't mean to be a jerk. I haven't had a whole lot of really educated people to talk about it because everything about it was a wet blanket. And you know that from a journalism standpoint. This thing happened in June. The scab got ripped off kind of in August, right? And nobody was talking to anybody about any of it, right? And a lot of it does become scuttlebutt unless the onion is peeled back, and that's usually done by lawyers, right? Literally, that's how we do get to these truths. Lawyers and journalists, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the lawyers, and they don't always, but they deserve credit for forcing these institutions and putting their feet to the fire and making them do these internal and oftentimes external investigations.
The political really side of the Board of Regents, and it's our fault, but maybe it's not our fault, and our lawyers say it's not our fault. To your point, it makes the kid a data point at that point. At that point, he's no longer a student athlete who's deceased. He's just a data point. And I think everybody here felt sort of itchy about that in August, right? And I don't know how we fix that on Saturdays and watching the games, but I guess that's for me to figure out. Keep doing great work, John. Thanks for making time for us.
Thank you. Appreciate the time.
John Frankel, obviously, I'm a little passionate about it too because I haven't talked a whole lot about it, but if it were my son or your son, come on, man. Great work. HBO Real Sports, my dear friend Andrew Kramer, who is doing Thursday Night Football now with Anna Storm, and our partner Brian Billick on behalf of the Living Classrooms Foundation. So good for them, and I'm sure I'll be chatting with Brian and Andrew, and hopefully Hannah as well about that. So there. HBO Real Sports, it's HBO and HBO 2 if you want to check that out. Go to HBO On Demand. They do great work. It's not TV. It's HBO. Nasty at WNST.net finds me. I'm out in the Buy at Toyota.com Audio Vaults 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device. By downloading the TuneIn Radio app, we do come in crystal clear from anywhere in the world. Our morning newspaper is served digitally to your email inbox each and every morning at 7 a.m. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life. Also, the Maryland Jockey Club and Laurel, where they're racing this weekend. The Maryland Million is October the 20th. We got Turf Cup ahead as well. You can always find the entries at the front of WNST.net as well as in our morning newspaper. I am Nestor. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.